Go. All right, so we're back in the studio for the summer. I'm Chris Russell, and I'm here with Jordan Lester.
Hello.
This is Rustling Lesters, a.k.a. Lestering Pages Part 2. So Jordan, how's it been going all summer? I haven't really seen you too much.
It's been interesting. Just been looking for work, keeping an eye on developments in the news and that type of thing, doing courses. That's
definitely what we're going to talk about today. Let's start with the biggest development in the news, the whole Frank Coleman fiasco. So for anyone who doesn't know, which is probably very few people, Frank Coleman, leader of the Coleman Group of companies, was basically acclaimed to be leader of the Progressive Conservative Party of Newfoundland and Labrador and subsequently our new premier. But he stepped down recently, citing a personal family matter, which may or may not be true. I'm giving him the benefit of the doubt. I think a lot of people are. So what do you think of the whole situation, Jordan? Give me your general notes on it.
I can definitely see it from two sides. I think there could be a genuine family concern that might have come up within the last week. But yeah, if it was for political reasons, as some political science professors at MUN have pointed out, citing family reasons is one of the oldest tricks in the book of bowing out of a political career when you come under pressure. So I'm inclined to think it's a little bit of both. That in talking to a lot of people, they've told me that while Coleman might be a good business person, he's not a very good communicator. He's very shy. He kind of lacks charisma. And that while he might be good talking to people one-on-one, he's not necessarily good at staying on a script, talking to people in a large setting. And he waited way too long to talk about his policies. Like, it often seemed that many of his policies he announced, like being open to privatizing the liquor corporation, were almost like ad hoc, off-the-cuff comments in response to questions from journalism. He was always too reactive to other people's attacks on him and questions to him, rather than being proactive. So people always went looking for dirt on him, basically. And right. I guess he couldn't handle it.
Yeah, no, I mean, and like what you said about whether or not it's a personal family issue, it's like the rumor was that he was maybe looking for a way out. So whether or not the family thing is true, I think it probably is, but it definitely came at a very convenient time for him, and left the party in shambles, kind of.
It left the party in shambles, and now I think that party needs to do what they should have done all along, which is that, I mean, it was very reckless, I think, for the caucus and the cabinet to just line up behind him without, like, any full competition.
Yeah.
I mean, honestly, unless you don't have the funds to run a campaign, it makes no sense to pull out of a competition until you've at least gone to the first ballot.
Yeah.
Because what often happens is that a leader, as we've seen with other parties, be it the NDP or the Liberals sometimes in the past, they didn't always win on the first ballot. And then even if you don't come in first, then you can still play kingmaker, because then you have delegates on the table, and then you can say, well, you need to change your position on this, this, and this, and then I'll send my delegates your way.
Absolutely.
But if you pull out before a delegate selection's finished and before the convention's even happened, you've basically surrendered your ability to influence the process.
Yeah. I mean, that being said, there's some circumstances, like I mean, in this situation anyway, I understand Bill Barry's reason for leaving completely. I mean,
that was reasonable.
The whole caucus was against him. Danny Williams was against him, and that was obviously the biggest, at least not necessarily his biggest influence, but the biggest influence on the caucus.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, if the governing party wants to renew themselves, they can't renew themselves by everyone backing behind one person, leaving someone to become premier who's completely untested, doesn't have an opportunity to talk about policies, doesn't have an opportunity to see how they hand up the pressure, because a lot of people forget that leadership races are like a dry run for a general election.
Oh, absolutely.
Same with nomination races. That when you have a competitive nomination race or a competitive leadership, it helps you to know, okay, how strong is our get out the vote machine? What problems could we run into in the general election? Oh, sorry. A little bit of feedback. Yeah. And other than that, I mean, from what I was able to tell, there was an emergency meeting, I think on Tuesday, where they're talking about reopening the entire leadership race because he backed out on Monday. And I think they need at least 5 people to run to make it a proper process. Yeah. And maybe, like, I know there were some people, like, I don't know his name. There was some young fellow out in Corner Brook or something. He wanted to run or something, but he didn't get his signatures in time and stuff like that.
Right.
Maybe some of those people who are kind of waiting out on the wings, who wanted to run, but maybe they didn't have the organization in place.
Right.
They've almost kind of gotten a second chance. And this is the other thing I might add about what the significance of this. This is actually the first time I know of in Newfoundland history that we've had a premier designate that didn't become premier.
Well, that's the thing. That's why they're having these emergency meetings, and the party has no idea what they're going to do, is because this is never...
It's unprecedented.
It's never happened. Exactly. It's unprecedented. So I think what they're saying right now is I heard Tommy Williams on the radio yesterday, and he was basically like, I can't say anything for sure because we haven't made a decision, but I can't see a situation where there's a convention in July is pretty much what the party's saying.
I heard Trevor Taylor on an interview suggest that his sources were saying that the leadership convention would be moved to September.
Yeah, that's what they're saying, shortly after Labor Day.
Yeah, but he was advocating for it to be moved to the end of October. So I'm finding it interesting that this time around, it seems that people are a little bit more willing to speak out. I guess maybe people in the party have seen that, like people who are critical of the process that maybe weren't as public, I guess they've seen how much damage it did to the party, that it's better for people in the party to criticize that party, to prevent that party making mistakes, than to not say anything and then have the disrepute of the entire party and the entire government.
Absolutely. So John Ottenheimer's in. Steve Kent seems to be all but in. I mean, I can't speak for him or anything, but it seems like Steve Kent is going to be in as long as all goes well with the birth of his new baby. Mm-hmm. And is there anyone else that you can think of or might like to see throw their name into the ring?
I thought it was curious. There was an interview done where people had went to Bill Barry and said, what do you think of Run? He's like, well, I'm open to it, but I need to talk to people first.
Right.
Because I guess after he pulled out as he did, I guess he kind of has to gauge whether people would be willing to have him run again or not. Yeah,
well, I actually heard Bill Barry, maybe you were listening to the same one, but he called into Back Talk, and he was talking to Pete Soucy, and he said it was, I mean, I'm paraphrasing, but it was to the effect of basically, if things aren't the same as they were last time, and I actually have caucus support, or at least not direct caucus, what's the opposite of support? Like anti-support. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And he was basically like, if the situation was not the same as it was last time, as far as the support and stuff goes, he'd definitely consider it. So, I mean, I wouldn't mind seeing Bill Barry back in. He's not necessarily my guy, but he'd definitely be in there making things interesting, shaking things up.
Yeah, I mean, that's something we saw last time. I think I'd read in another media interview that he had suggested some kind of idea of why can't everyone over the age of 18 vote on who the leader would be. I think what he was invoking, from what I know, is that with the Alberta Progressive Conservatives, there's actually a tendency that the people who tend to vote for the leader aren't necessarily just progressive conservatives. You have people who might be members of other parties who temporarily join that party in order to back one candidate or another. And what that does is it's almost like having a mini election that that the person you chose is going to get public support and is more than likely going to win the next election. That's why the Alberta PCs have been in power for 45 years.
Exactly, yeah. For you to not vote in the leadership election you're pretty much throwing away your say in the process, because I mean the PCs are going to win at least for the foreseeable future until they screw something up seriously.
Yeah.
The PCs are in Alberta. Yeah. And so that's totally, but I think the Liberals too, our Liberals, they just did that too.
Yeah, they have a supporter category where anyone can sign up to vote. And there were weird things that had happened where there were people who were members of the PCs who had also signed up as supporters. So clearly that kind of process wouldn't preclude people who are normally supporters of other parties. But I guess the idea is that it's more democratic in the sense that because you did have a premier resign and then you had an interim premier that wasn't directly elected during a general election.
Absolutely.
It was selected by the caucus. It kind of reasserts the idea that the people still choose the premier in between elections.
Totally.
It's just an internal election within that party as opposed to a general election for 45, 48 seats.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. Speaking of the Liberals, they had their AGM last weekend.
I heard.
They put forward a couple of policy initiatives, proposals, or whatever you may call it. One, probably the most public one, lowering the voting age to 16. What do you think about that?
I personally like it as long as it's tied to better civics education, because frankly, what I remember in junior high and high school was that when I opened my junior high textbook in the year 2000, it still said the Soviet Union existed.
Absolutely.
That, outdated textbooks that frankly misrepresented history because of lack of investment in education under previous governments. So I guess any move to lower the voting age has to be coupled with better civic education and engagement. And I would even go so far as to say that lower it to 16 and then maybe 4 or 8 years' time, if that goes well, lower it to 14.
Oh, wow. That's radical.
I mean, 20 years down the road, I'd even be okay with 12 and then stop there.
Yeah. Yeah. Any younger. Well, I mean, if you're younger than 12, then you're in elementary school.
Yeah, exactly. I think 12 would be the youngest that someone could make an informed vote. I think once in the U.S., they had this controversial proposal that for lowering voting ages below 16, that there were concerns about how can a 12 or 14-year-old vote, that people had suggested like giving someone half of a vote or a quarter of a vote, but then that gets really messy and it sends the wrong message.
And it also, it kind of puts a sour taste in people's mouth, because the last time that people were considered as less than one full person was when they were referring to slaves.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Or like
for the purpose, in the U.S. Constitution, for the purpose of census, and whatever, each colored person shall count as 0.75.
Yeah, it's that same kind of insulting racism, that type of thing. I think the last time people would be that insulted by something locally is when then Liberal leader Jim Bennett suggested a two-tiered wage system, that people under the age of 19 be allowed to be paid a lower minimum wage than people over 19. And Jim Bennett fell in the caucus revolt in 2006.
I mean, I don't necessarily. It's like, it's actually Max and Brandon were talking about that on theirs, which is pointless to say because theirs is not available to be listened to. So, but that's okay.
To go a little bit off topic.
It's like the way. I mean, in principle, like with that one sentence, I would agree with that. But then you get into, how do you decide what the difference should be? How do you decide this,
exactly.
this, and that? I mean, because I mean, the way I look at it, it's like I was making minimum wage when I was working at Marie's, trying to pay rent and bills and everything else. But that I was making when I was 16 years old, working at Tim's and making minimum wage. That is relative to, it's not the most money I've ever been making, but relative to my expenses, that's by far the richest I've been thus far in my life. So I mean, that's where it ends. After that, it gets fuzzy when you go below the surface.
And I guess just to tie this back to what you were originally talking about, it's the danger of leaders unilaterally announcing policy. Whether it was Jim Bennett with two-tiered wages or Frank Coleman, or I was reading a little bit with the Ontario election that apparently when Tim Hudak had announced cutting 100,000 jobs, apparently the caucus said that they were never consulted. Yeah. That they literally found out about it as they were reading the news. Exactly. And I mean, Lorraine Michael from people like Dale Kirby and Mitchell Moore have faced similar criticisms about, there were times that Lorraine on the airwaves would announce, I'm in favor of increasing income taxes on the wealthy, but even though hadn't talked to the caucus. So I think it's fair to say that while the problems right now may be focused on the PC party, trust me, I think the other parties at different points in time, different provinces, have the same problems.
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, me and Devin and Adam Foote kind of got into a little bit of a Twitter argument with like Ryan Steves and Adam Quirk the other day about, they were hating on the whole PC, like the PCs are a joke. Ha ha ha! Look at what a failure they are. But I mean, it's funny how quick people can forget where they were. I don't know. 18 months ago, where their party was. I mean,
or I was thinking, back in the 90s when the Liberals allowed tuition at MUN to go up 35%. Or things like that. So I mean, parties change over time, it seems.
Oh, absolutely.
The Liberals today aren't what they were 20 years ago. The PCs today aren't what they were 10 years ago, 20 years ago.
No.
Parties evolve over time.
Oh, absolutely, they do. And I mean, the Liberals are constantly evolving because they don't have any true policy. But that's okay. That's a conversation for another day.
Yes, it is.
Yeah. But I mean, I want to take it just one more thing on the voting age of 16. It's like, I agree with it needs to be tied to a better civics education, but I think that needs to be introduced first. You know what I mean? The Liberals' logic, I'm gonna say it. It's their logic is that the people who are 16 are gonna vote Liberal. That's what they think. That may be true. It may not be true. But
that is something I have speculated with other people as well.
Oh, that's absolutely.
That there is a certain amount of political self-interest. If I remember correctly, the person who proposed it, Jeff Marshall, actually wants to run for the Liberals in Kilbride.
Jeff Marshall's seeking the nomination in Kilbride. Yeah.
So, I mean, I think there's two sides to this. On one hand, it's a policy and a principle. On the other hand, let's face it, every policy has electoral implications. Will it get you votes? Will it lose you votes?
Yeah.
Will it help you get seats? Will it lose you seats?
Yeah. I mean, I'm fully in favor of it because
Same here.
when I was in high school, I know that in most Newfoundland schools it's not an option, but at our high school
there were ballots, mock votes.
Well, that, and I mean, we had the classes. Like I took in grade 11, I took economics. In grade 12, I took economics and political science, and those got me so interested. That was really what got me started on pretty much everything that I do today as far as my interests go. And that I would consider at that time that I was interested, I became interested enough to vote. I was 15 or 16, I was interested enough to vote. But I had just started learning about this stuff, and I wouldn't say that I could have made an informed vote. So I think that what the Liberals should be proposing here should be, we intend, if the Liberals form, when in government, however they phrase those policy initiatives, to introduce new, better civics programs into the education system, like to the tune of, mandatory grade 10 and 11 economics and political science, and then in grade 12 it becomes an elective type thing.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, if you're going to allow people to vote at 16, between the ages of 12 to 15,
that's when they need to get prepared.
Yeah, because I mean, in a lot of places in the world, in some places in the world, people are actually considered adults at 12.
Yeah.
And when you become 12, that's when you've kind of left elementary school.
Yeah.
You're kind of starting to develop some independence. So I think in those, those 5-6 key years before 16, you got to have that education then. Then when 16 comes by, they already know. I think the other justification I'd heard is it was something like when people are rooted in their high schools, they're more likely to know local issues than after they graduate, when they might move to another province. They move to a province, they don't know anything about the issues. They
move to St. John's East.
Yeah, but I think that as well, I guess, also suggests that because, like us young people, we are transient, we move around a lot, that, like, if someone from Nova Scotia comes here, or let's just say I move to BC, well, those universities, those workplaces also need to have some role in educating people who are coming from other provinces and be like, hey, this is how things work here. And then, you can have a conversation about, well, this is how we did things in Nova Scotia or BC. These are some of the lessons we could learn that we should bring here, et cetera, et cetera.
Totally. Yeah. No, I think it's like, I'm not, I'll often be first to jump on hating on the Liberals, and I'm not hating on the idea of lowering the voting age to 16. But I think that it needs to be better planned out, and basically their plan is to lower it and then start the education, which is obviously that's measure once, cut twice, not the other way around. So there's a lot wrong with that, but it's okay because hopefully they won't form the next government.
Yeah, the only thing I could say is that it occurred to me that Ryan Steves had come on here on the show before. It'd almost be interesting to hear his perspective on this as well.
Well, it's like now that we're doing things a little more freely, it's like I'm going to see when Ryan, when someone from PC Mon Conservatives, even, ask Megan Barnhill or Noah or someone to come on and talk about the NDP, and really just, we're doing it freely, just get anyone and everyone on to see, to see what they think about what's on the go. Yeah.
Yeah, and there's also that, what is it? I think Chris Bruce is trying to start up some NL Green Party thing.
Yes, someone told me that.
Yeah,
I think Russell Cochran was telling me that.
Yeah, there was some article about it.
Yeah, I mean, he can do that. They'll just not get elected or whatever. Yeah, I mean, it's like the Green Party have 2 people in the House of Commons right now, and that's they've doubled their numbers. And 20 years from now, they might be where the NDP was 10 years ago. You know what I mean? It's like that's the trajectory of the Green Party. So, if Chris Bruce wants to do that and be the the Newfoundland Ralph Nader, go for it. But yeah, I mean, as far as I think that we may have just covered all that was worth covering.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's good for him. The Green Party, I guess. I mean, I almost feel the same way about a Green Party here, at least for now, as I do about our next topic. CFS AGM was a few weeks ago. They brought forward some proposals. Most that I've read I disagree with. Some are fine. But the big one, I know you haven't heard too much about it, but it pretty much speaks for itself. What would it be? Member unions will be it resolved that member unions will begin campaigning to their administrations to freeze all current oil investment, eventually reducing it to zero and selling it all off, divestment. So I want to hear how you feel about that. I know how I feel about it, but how do you feel about that?
Obviously, I can only comment on the principle as I haven't seen the wording. I do find it confusing how CFS, if you try to talk to them about other economic issues, they'll throw back an argument at you of, well, that's not a student issue. That's not an issue we can comment on. But then on other issues like this, like I mean, I'm not really sure if they're talking about like divestment of oil companies like sponsoring universities, or if they're talking about like governments like ceasing to support oil exploration. Like
what it is it's ceasing like oil companies' investment in the university. I do believe, because I mean, what the university doesn't just own stocks in oil companies type of thing, but the oil companies give tens of millions of dollars to the university.
I just, on a practical level, I see a problem with that, because let's just say even if they achieve their goal of oil companies divesting from the university, if that happens before the needs-based grants kick in, if that happens like for the federal government, there's still loans there. I mean, I could see that really hurting the engineering program, the, computer science, and some of these people. So, I don't know. I'm really, to me, just the fact that this happened, and despite the fact that I checked the news several times a day, I was not able to find anything about this. Yeah. I think there's some real transparency and accountability issues within the CFS that, as a member, I'm not hearing about policies they're supporting until after they've supported them. And then when journalists try to get into the meetings, they sometimes say, sorry, this is in camera, you have to leave. Or sorry, only one journalist is approved to cover an entire convention where there are multiple things happening in multiple rooms.
That one journalist probably being like a former CFS chairperson.
Or a former CFS chairperson, or someone from the student media.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's deeply disturbing, I guess, on a procedural level, that they could support something like this without anyone in the grassroots, knowing that they're doing this. The fact that they did this in the summer when people are less likely to be looking at it's a very cynical move. I can't understand how it is that if the federal conservatives, if they had done something like this, people would jump down their throat.
Yeah.
And you would have a logical debate.
And as you know, the CFS hates the non-political organization that is the CFS. They hate the federal conservatives. They love the NDP. But then
they use some of the exact same tactics.
Oh, of course they do.
And it's so hypocritical. It comes across of, it's okay when we do it, but not when you do it.
Totally.
And that is something I do find in certain far left-wing organizations that frankly bother me. And that's why when people have asked me in the past, well, Jordan, what are your political beliefs? I mean, economically, I think I'm somewhere on the left of center, centrist. But I mean, on civil and political issues, I consider myself a little bit more of a libertarian.
Right.
Just because whether it's a left-wing government or a right-wing government, when you concentrate too much power in the hands of a government or a corporation or a union, they find ways to abuse their power and not consult people.
Absolutely. And it's not...
You need solid checks and balances.
It's not just conservatives that do that.
Yeah, liberals do this. I mean, in Manitoba, the Manitoba NDP went back on a promise that they would never raise the GST. And they did this behind the backs of their own members. They lied to voters. They actually, I'm not sure if you'd heard, but the Manitoba NDP did something that really bothered me. They actually tried to limit academic freedom in Manitoba universities to say that the government would be allowed to disallow programs offered by universities that were deemed to not be employable.
Oh, wow.
And there was actually an outcry from the academic unions going, look, universities are supposed to have autonomy from universities. I mean, there was a little bit of a crisis here over choosing of the presidency at Mon in 2008, but that's nothing compared to like direct government interference in what someone be allowed to teach, which reminds me of another issue I meant to mention, which was out at the University of Saskatchewan when a head of a medical department or something had spoke out against cuts that the university was doing, and the president of the university turned around and said, "You're fired," basically revoked their tenure, stripped them of their pay, and police escorted them off campus for criticizing. Like, I really wonder sometimes about the freedom of speech in our campuses.
There's very little.
Very little when governments on both the left, the right, and the center, be it the Manitoba NDP or a president of the University of Saskatchewan, can just unilaterally remove something that someone's got through collective bargaining or law or a promise they've made to a voter when they're going into a ballot box. It really bothers me.
Well, one thing that I'll tell you, I know, I'm not going to use any names, but I know a couple, speaking of free speech, and you're going to love this. Everyone should love this. So there's a couple of guys, they plan on setting up, not even necessarily a full society, but a free speech. They want a table in the fall. They put in, obviously, very, very early for that table booking.
I might have heard about this.
And I heard from one of the, not the current exec, this is in the time of the old exec, but I heard from one of them that the other ones were basically like, obviously we cannot let these guys, these guys support this and this and this and this. And it's like, they don't support those things. They support your right to say those things. And also, no matter what, even if the guys supported killing puppies, it's like you're telling the Free Speech Society that they can't table on campus because of what they believe and what they want to say. I mean, the irony, you could swim in it.
That's basically handing them recruitment on a silver platter of, some people might say to them, well, why should our group exist? If that's the response of the student union or the university, that's basically going to be their recruitment drive given to them on a silver platter.
Yeah.
Like, I get that there are reasonable limits. Like, for example, like hate speech, for example, is one. But even I've heard that sometimes, there's very clear hate speech, and then sometimes people use hate speech regulations to actually regulate political speech that is not hate speech.
Absolutely.
By calling it hate speech. And I know that's a little bit tricky, but that's a topic for another time.
Totally.
There's some problems with some human rights commissions in this country, but that's another issue.
There's actually another, I would say it's almost an even worse motion from the CFS AGM, and I didn't tell you about it before we were recording because I think that it would be better to have your surprise, unless you have heard about it. But basically, they motioned, and it passed, that I was reading it, and I was like, okay, at the start I was like, fair enough, and then it very quickly took a turn for the worse. They motioned that this is how they sold it, due to the way that governments and administration treat student unions, we feel that it would be prudent to take $250,000 of the current surplus and put it in whatever their fund is called, the Student Rights Legal Defense Fund. Same fund they use for defending themselves, same fund they use for suing defederators, whatever. Which, as we know, that's what they do a lot of. But then be it further resolved in the motion that $250,000 be put into the fund every year. So they're beefing up. Oh, I wish everyone could have just seen Jordan's face because it was exactly what I expected. So basically, they're beefing it up. They're beefing it up so that they can just, keep the universities in line.
Yeah, I mean, and this is where I'm going to weigh in a little bit. I mean, just to give some context for some of the people who are going to be listening to this, I think it was back in March or April or maybe May, Calpino University, they had their vote to defederate. And despite the fact that they sent out their deputy national chairperson, Jessica McCormick, who used to be involved with Muntzu here and CFS chairperson, people there still voted in favor. And what I heard was that not too long after they voted in favor, all of a sudden CFS contacts them and be like, yeah, you owe us up to $1 million in CFS fees, therefore your referendum's invalid. Like, frankly, some of the methods of the CFS to keep people part of their organization, it kind of reminds me of a very, very, very nonviolent, toned-down version of when people used to try to leave the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
And then, but, only it's not tanks, it's lawsuits. Mm-hmm. It's not killing people, it's assassinating their character.
Yeah.
Assassinating their cause.
Yeah. No, it's despicable, really.
And I know it's pretty controversial to say that, and some people were very surprised that I liked some of their material on Facebook, and my justification is that if CFS is throwing outside resources into a referendum that is supposed to be just for students, and spreading that over social media, that I had an obligation to spread the leave side over social media so that at least the we should leave side could get a fair say.
Totally. Yeah, and they... what was I going to say?
I think there was up to 15 other student unions that were considering leaving.
Oh, there's all kinds.
Yeah. So it sounds to me like what they're doing is they're almost permanently retrenching into this kind of siege mentality.
Totally.
Of assuming that from now on, that they're going to face one referendum every year for who knows how long.
Yeah. And I mean, CFS has an operating budget of like $3.5 million. So you're talking 10% almost of that. Just going to beefing up the legal fund.
That's going to be diverting from other things they do.
Of course, yeah.
And I find that worrying that, this is being done behind closed doors.
Yeah, oh, totally. I mean, I'm not gonna say all unions are like this, but I mean, when we hear horror stories about unions, this is the type of thing. It's the leadership wanting to keep things the way it is. And I mean, it's a lot of what they were saying when the Bill 22 stuff was on the go, but that's all resolved now anyway. But yeah, that sucked. But yeah, they, it's very backhanded, it's very shady, and it's not doing anything to benefit students. Beefing up your legal fund so that you can sue students is not helping students, and that should be the only thing that the CFS is looking to do.
Honestly, I think a better use of the money would be the fact that student unions on campus have legal funds to help students that are battling landlords or battling university administration. I hear of people who get kicked out of residence on very questionable grounds.
Oh, yeah.
Like people discriminating against them based on sexual orientation or disability or these type of things. I think, honestly, if CFS was spending $500,000 a year to litigate people like university administrations that were violating charter rights or violating academic freedom, can you imagine what benefit that would be to freedom of speech?
Oh, yeah. And
as opposed to using it to stifle that?
Oh, yeah. And I mean, and then I would love CFS instead of thinking that they're a bunch of cunts. And I'm going to take advantage of the fact that this is not being broadcast to say what I want. But, I mean swearing wise, not content wise. I would say anything broadcasting, but it's, I don't know. They suck. They're also, every motion had, the way the executive recommends that it, the executive recommend that this motion pass type thing. And, that's garbage too.
Yeah. I can't really comment on, right. This is something as well I'd heard in doing a little bit of research about some people try to understand, why is the student movement in this country so, like, ideologically divided. And I guess the bit of research I had done had showed that a lot of the origins of the CFS in the early 80s was among student activists who were disenfranchised with the NDP for the fact that under Ed Broadbent, they were beginning to move more towards the center.
Right.
And so, in many ways, CFS can often look like an extension of the NDP. And in the later 90s, at a conference called the Winds of Change, another organization started up called CASA, the Canadian Association of Student Alliance,
Right.
which was a little bit more of a conservative student union that was aligned a little bit more with the PC Party and the Reform Party. And then you also get these provincial ones, like Quebec has half a dozen.
Mm-hmm.
Then you get Ontario ones. So you get student unions and associations that fall on the left and the right and the center of the spectrum. But we don't really talk about that. Like,
Well, because they're non-political organizations.
they're supposed this is the thing. They say they're nonpartisan, but they're certainly not non-ideological.
Well, who was I talking to in the last few days? Maybe it was, we had a meeting last night and we were talking about it, but when the last federal election was happening in 2011, they supplied buses to go to a Liberal rally. They supplied buses. I'm talking about Munsu even now, not CFS. They supplied buses to go to a Liberal rally, buses to go to a NDP rally, and buses to protest Stephen Harper's speech.
Yikes. I mean, the logical thing for a student union to do is that if you're going to provide people rides to political rallies, you have to provide them rides to all political rallies.
Yes.
To ensure that every student of every viewpoint has an equal opportunity.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's...
Or you just don't provide it at all.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, because it's not even like they... that last part is what makes it so hurting. It's not that they just sent them to the Liberal and NDP and nothing to the Conservatives. They sent a bus for protesters to the Conservatives.
And some people who used to be involved with the student union who are probably going to be upset with me saying this, that it wasn't exactly a secret that some people on Munsu, when the Occupy movement was happening, were kind of covertly supporting Occupy Newfoundland and Labrador.
Oh, absolutely. Oh, absolutely they were. But, I mean, I don't know. Most people have no idea what that was. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's like 10% of... And I mean, not just Newfoundland. I mean, every Occupy movement all around the world, 10% of people, and that's generous, actually were there for the real reason. I don't know. Yeah. I don't know, Jordan. I just don't know. Is there anything else that you...
wanted to talk about?
Yeah, what's on your mind?
Yeah, I mean, part of what I'm wondering is, so I guess to go back to what we were originally talking about, I guess Tom Marshall has to stay on a little bit longer.
Yeah, and he's so sad about it too.
So yeah, I guess we're still gonna have that by-election out in Stephenville East.
Oh yeah, that's gotta happen now. That we can't wait for Coleman's by-election.
Yeah, and frankly, if I were any of these people who were thinking of running for the leadership, and the fact that there's been no candidate selected out there, if I were one of those people who were thinking about going for the leadership, I would be considering running for that seat.
Oh yeah, John Ottenheimer should already have declared his intentions to go for that seat.
And to get that seat, because if you get that seat in advance of the delegate selection process, no one can say, well, I'm not sure if I should vote for you because you don't have a seat.
Exactly.
You can say, well, actually, I ran to get a seat at the first available opportunity.
Totally. Although losing that would make you kind of not look like you should.
It's a risky strategy.
Yeah. Oh, but I mean, John Ottenheimer, he's a popular enough guy. What was his district before?
Yeah, his district actually used to be St. John's East.
Okay, so
which
I mean,
had previously
he's not...
been Buckingham and now is George Murphy.
Yeah.
But I mean, even with George Murphy, if you look at by-elections can often be a warm-up for the general election, even if you run in another district.
Oh, absolutely.
Because George had originally run out in Conception Bay, East Bell Island.
Right.
And lost
Yeah.
in fall 2010, but then won in the general election. So there's no reason why Ottenheimer couldn't run out there.
Yeah, and I mean they parachute people in like that all the time. Mulrooney,
Absolutely.
was a businessman, took leadership of the PCs and ran in Central Nova. Friggin' Peter MacKay and his it was his dad's district at the time, and then he stepped down so Brian could run. And then in the next election, Brian ran in Laval or whatever his district was, and McKay went back to Central Nova and, won with like 90% of the vote.
It's not unheard of for leaders to run in seats in by-elections that are not their own, just to give them a seat.
Yeah, just to legitimize them.
So that they have the legitimacy, exactly. Yeah. So I'm going to be curious to see how this leadership race plays out and to see whether or not the governing party has learned their lessons.
Who would you like to see? It's okay if you don't answer, but I mean, it's not like you're really directly affiliated with the party or anything. Exactly. So who, if you had to pick someone declared, not declared, looks like they're going to declare, doesn't look like they're going to declare, anyone, who would you want to see as the new leader and thus your new premier, at least for the time being?
My honest answer right now is I really don't know.
Yeah?
I really don't know, because after what happened before of so many people backing out, back Frank Coleman without any justification. I mean, I think that it tarnished some of them a little bit.
Yeah.
That they came across as political opportunists, that they were willing to take the path of least resistance.
Yeah.
So frankly, I don't know.
Well, one thing I saw...
frankly, I would just say the more people that run, the better.
Totally.
Because as we've seen, you can have candidates be kicked out for breaking party principles and questionable tweets that might violate the charter.
Wayne Bennett's just the stupidest guy in the province.
And then, Bill Barry pulling out as a protest to point out his concerns about the process. I mean, I pulled out of the student union election due to concerns of the process. So
totally.
it'd be hypocritical for me to criticize him for doing what I did in a different position. And now Frank Coleman leaving for family reasons. It's just think about this. If we had more than 3 people running, this whole process wouldn't have been canceled. It would have still been going. It still would have been in July. Yeah. That there is actually such a thing as having too few people running. Then something unforeseen happens. And then you got to reboot the entire process and people get exhausted.
Totally.
And they begin to lose interest. I think a lot of the public right now are kind of getting leadership race exhaustion.
Yeah.
Of the fact that we've been talking about this for 6 months and then to go, and now we got to start all over again?
Yeah.
What?
That being said, I think now it's going to be... Oh, one thing I wanted to say back before I go into that. Right after the Coleman announcement, Don Bradshaw tweeted, he said, basically, anyone who comes forward now, the first question is, why didn't you go before?
Yep.
And that's totally true, and it's totally fair.
Yeah, and this is the thing. I think if we've seen with Frank Coleman, if anyone was naive to think that they would run and get a free ride just because they have a backing of a former premier.
Yeah.
If Frank Coleman could be sunk like that, despite the backing of Danny Williams, honestly, you could have the most powerful person in the world back you.
Yeah.
But if you don't have the most important people backing you in a democracy, which is the people who vote,
yes,
the people who vote at conventions, the people who vote at the ballot box, it doesn't matter who's on your side. If you can't get the public support, you don't have the right to govern.
Yeah.
And it's also interesting. It was interesting as well because with Coleman, he didn't have a seat at the time.
No.
And it's funny how in opposition, the PCs could criticize the Liberals for having Roger Grimes govern as an unelected premier.
Yeah.
It's just funny the juxtaposition, like in people's minds, it created a bad taste in their mouth, if you will.
Totally.
Of they couldn't understand, okay, so the Liberals do something similar, but, the circumstances are different. It's just, it's so messy.
Yeah. But, the system is that, once the new leader is selected, the election needs to be called within the year.
Yep. Which is good.
And Roger Grimes did that, so I don't know why they were always hating, but
yeah,
it's how the system works.
Some people actually say that this current law, which actually is affecting us now, was drafted by Danny Williams actually in response to what had happened. Because what had happened, just to give a little bit of political history, was that Brian Tobin won an election in 1999. He resigns in 2000 to go get a cabinet post with John Chrétien.
Well, because he thought that he was going to become leader of the federal Liberals. Yeah, that's not confirmed. But
there were also rumors he was going to run in 2006, and then he decided not to.
Yeah.
There was that, clearly. But what had happened was there was a divisive leadership race between John Efford and Roger Grimes with it was something like 30 votes or 6 votes, like separating.
It's 14.
14.
I'm just
14.
reading a couple books right now.
Yeah, and it was 14 votes that separated them.
Yeah.
And I guess he was premier for about 2 years before he called the election.
Yeah.
So when the PCs came into power, the first thing they did was pass this House of Assembly Act, basically to ensure that a new premier, the power wouldn't go to their head.
Right.
It's to create those checks and balances I talked about.
Yeah.
Like, for all my criticisms I might have of this and that party, I think that was a good first step. And it's also why I kind of liked also having the fixed election dates. Because as we've seen with Harper, I mean, I honestly wonder why we don't have a law like this at the federal level. Let's just say in 2011, if the NDP had won, Jack Layton would have been prime minister for 4 months. He would have died.
Yeah.
Then Mulcair would have been prime minister, and he wouldn't have had to call an early election.
Yeah.
I actually begin to wonder.
Is there no law like that at the
There's
federal
nothing
level?
like that at the federal
Okay.
level. There's something like that at the provincial level in 2004. And I'm beginning to wonder that now with so many provinces having fixed election dates and a lot of premiers finding ways to get around them, that a law like this would be a good way to kind of close that loophole of, oh, well, Parliament was dysfunctional. I had no choice but to call an early election.
Totally.
You know, because there might be circumstances where you can't follow a fixed election date. You just need to have some accountability, a change of leader, that type of thing.
Absolutely. And I mean, the reason that there probably isn't anything at the federal level is because it hasn't been an issue. You know
It
what I
has
mean?
been an issue,
like
and
you
it
said,
didn't happen here until it was an issue.
Exactly. So yeah, like you said, they drafted it in response to the Roger Grimes thing, and yeah, I mean, I don't know.
Yeah, and I just felt it was important to highlight this because, like, these events that led to this law are almost a decade old, right?
Yeah.
So there are people whose political consciousness began to develop at the time of Danny Williams.
Yes.
Who might not remember the things that happened before, so I thought it was important to kind of put it into the record.
Yeah, that would be about roughly when my political consciousness came. It was 2001 when he got elected leader.
Yeah.
And me and my dad were golfing like across from Confederate. We weren't golfing across, but we were in the park just hitting balls. And he was basically like Danny Williams, and that Danny Williams is the first politician's name I ever knew. And that was when Dad was like, "This is the guy," and then he was right. He was the guy. 44 out of 48 seats, baby. Yeah. Hopefully, that stays the same way, but it won't, unfortunately. Yeah.
And yeah, all I can say as well is that, another thing I can say about the political landscape right now is that where Coleman was so much on the defensive and an opportunity for the PC party is that the attacks have been entirely on the PC party to prove why they should continue to govern, that the Liberals haven't really been getting the full scrutiny they deserve either. I mean, as we've seen in Nova Scotia, for example, you can toss out the Nova Scotia NDP. The Liberals can promise, oh, we're going to tear up Muskrat Falls, we're not going to do this, and then get in government and then do the complete opposite.
Well, that tends to be what Liberals do.
Yeah, it tends to be what Liberals do. They campaign to the left and govern to the right, or they campaign to the right and govern to the left.
Well, they did.
And that I think it's about time that maybe the PCs and the Liberals be put under equal scrutiny. Because right now, Dwight Ball's getting a free ride.
Oh, absolutely.
Like, he's not charismatic. He hasn't really said much
he
about...
He looks like a president. He looks like it. He's got...
Oh, yeah.
He looks like what Mitt Romney almost looks like. You know what I mean?
I had noticed that before.
Yeah.
But this is what I mean, right? Like, right now, he's getting a free ride simply because the PCs are not popular. But we don't really even know what the Liberals stand for. A similar thing had happened in Quebec, actually, with the PQ, where the PQ... I mean... That was insane, where they tried to do some insane things with the Charter of Values.
Yeah.
And the Quebec Liberals just rode into power on an anti-PQ platform.
Absolutely.
Even though most voters didn't entirely understand what they were voting for. And just to sum up what we're talking about, is that people often don't vote governments in, they vote governments out.
Oh, absolutely. Governments aren't elected, they're defeated.
They're defeated.
Yeah,
and
that's
frankly, if I were a PC,
whatever.
the first thing you'd want to do is actually have a contested leadership race that gets the public excited, gets
which
the
I
membership
think this one will be
excited, actual policy debate, actual back and forth, actually presenting a vision for the future, reflection on the past and the present. And if that happens, I think the pressure on the Liberals and the NDP to start talking about their policies will the pressure will go on them of, well, you're so critical of them. Well, what would you do different? And if the Liberals just say, sorry, you got to wait till the election, well, then they're going to come under fire just as much, if not more, than Coleman.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And I mean, just another example, like what you were saying with the Nova Scotia Liberals, even the federal Liberals, it's like, Mulroney
we shall cut the GST and then raise it.
Yeah, we'll cut we're going to cut the GST. We're going to get rid of free trade. Both of those things still exist and are more effective than they've ever been. If anything,
at the time it was just the Canada-U.S. free trade agreement.
Exactly.
And then Chrétien expands it into NAFTA.
Exactly. Oh, yeah. Oh, God. Oh, my God. Don't even get me started. It's so true.
Or times of, I will never support a coalition and then support one.
Yeah.
I mean, frankly, I'll put it to you this way. Go back to the Ontario situation. As much as Hudak took fire for his policies, frankly, I like the fact that he had the guts
to have policies,
and to not, that he actually said, I thought it was interesting as well that he offered to resign if he couldn't fulfill his policies. Like, I can't remember a political leader in my lifetime who said, I can't remember Chrétien going, I will cut the GST, and if I don't, I will resign.
Yeah.
Like, I honestly wonder why we don't see more political leaders do that. Is it that many political leaders are afraid of the public?
Not many people get elected telling the truth.
Not many people get elected telling the truth, but yeah, you tell a lie, you get power for a bit, but then you'll get tossed out anyway.
Yeah, exactly.
So,
at least in Newfoundland politics, for the most part, you got the job for like 10 years.
Something like that.
Yeah, I mean, we've had like 6 governments. You know what I mean? We've formed very few separate governments because
because I'm just thinking. Let's see.
I mean, 22 years, then like 18 years, then the Liberals were in for like 14 years, and now 4 governments. We've had 4 governments. Yeah.
Yeah, 4 alternations. Yeah.
Yeah, 4. I mean, obviously, a lot of different leaders each time, but
PC,
and that's it. And we're in the second time the PCs have had government, and that's it.
Yeah.
We are at this point now. We're almost talking about 70 years.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's almost as bad as Alberta. No, not necessarily bad.
It's interesting you mentioned that because I'm trying to remember her name now, but I think if you look in the Center for Newfoundland Studies, I think Steph Roy had done a honors essay actually looking on premier duration by province and what factors lead to parties or leaders staying in power more often.
Yeah.
I mean, part of what I wonder sometimes with these radio waves, if something we could do to contribute to political discourse is to actually quote papers that students have written that right now aren't really in the political discourse, that a lot of times you have these papers and this research that's being done that never sees the light of day due to academic paywalls and that type of thing. But for the essays that are public, you kind of wonder, when a topic comes up, wouldn't it be interesting to see what the data says as opposed to just rhetoric and opinion? Like, rhetoric and opinion matters, but it's just good to kind of mix that in there too.
Totally. Yeah, and yeah, I mean, our premier length, Joey, obviously, you don't even need to, 23 years or something. Frank Moores was in there for like 8, but then Brian Peckford 10. For Beaton Tulk was in there for a second, but he doesn't count. The ones that it's like you don't really count as a premier unless you serve for at least like 5 years. Like Kathy Dunderdale won't. I mean, nothing against her. Love Kathy. We could probably have avoided this whole mess if Kathy was still around, or I mean, if the things that happened that caused Kathy not to still be around didn't happen, then Kathy would probably still be around. Well, duh. If the things hadn't happened, then she wouldn't have had to. Yeah. Anyway, you know what I mean. I mean, compared to some of the the Peckfords, the Williams, even just Joey's, obviously the Tobins, Clyde Wells. She only was premier for 2 years, two and a half years. So, and when you look at what the typical unless something changes and we start being more normal, But she won't go down as any not great of a premier, but I mean when we actually have more than like 11 premiers and you're looking at it, you'll see all these guys serving 8-10 years at a time, and then Kathy will just be like a little blip in the middle. And there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, things happen, but it's just, that's the way Newfoundland politics is.
I guess the fact as well that she was also our first female premier, I kind of worry as well that the fact that the duration of her political career was so short, I really hope it doesn't discourage women from running for the leadership, for
Absolutely.
example. Because I think that I've been reading in the Muse, I think maybe I can't remember her name, the president of PC Mun was interviewed about it. And she
Which one?
I can't
it would have been Megan Drudge
Megan
at the time.
Drudge, yeah. And I mean, whether it's been at the federal level, you look at Kim Campbell, who lasted 4 months.
Yeah.
Like, I kind of worry sometimes in Canadian politics that female prime ministers or premiers become synonymous with short tenure, unstable governments.
Absolutely.
And males with long-term, stable governments. That I kind of worry sometimes that, like, sometimes we're not getting the best premiers we could.
Yeah.
Just because women, and I mean, if you get into other things as well, like people who are gender nonconformists and this type of thing,
I think it'll be at least a little bit until we see them in elected politics.
Yeah.
Nothing against them from me, but that's a hard sell to a lot of the public, especially
and I
in
think
Newfoundland.
as well that I kind of wonder as well that, like, I know when Kathy Dunderdale was there, she was the first premier to need 24/7 police protection. I kind of worry sometimes about some of the sexism that went on, of chatter where sometimes people were judging her ability to be premier based on what she wore or how she presented herself, as opposed to her policies.
Yeah.
And to go back to the leadership, I really hope that I would like to see some women running as well. I don't want it to be all do you get what I mean? I just want to see people from various backgrounds, various incomes.
There's not really that many women that have. I mean, Johnson could go for it, but she's probably the only one who could win it.
That is a name I have heard tossed around before.
Well, I mean, anytime you've got those senior cabinet posts, finance, justice, education. Yeah. Those are all going to get thrown around first because those are, those, when someone steps down, that's the type of post that's going to be premier for the interim.
One of the other names I'd heard that some people would have loved to see run for premier, Elizabeth Marshall, of course, had a falling out with Danny Williams over some nursing negotiation for the Victorian Order of Nurses.
Right.
Where she had wanted to not give them as much as a pay increase, but Danny Williams unilaterally went over her head.
Yeah.
And as you might have read in some biographies, there were some things with Elizabeth Marshall and Danny Williams, so sometimes Danny Williams kind of stepping into her portfolios.
Oh, absolutely.
And making decisions without consulting her.
Yeah.
And yes, naturally...
what book I'm reading now is The War with Ottawa.
Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah,
exactly.
And right now she's in the Senate. So, I kind of wonder as well that sometimes we see some women who would be good premiers.
Yeah.
They're more likely to have a falling out with the leadership. They're more likely to leave politics. They're more likely to move to another level of politics than they are to pursue leadership provincially.
Yeah.
And I kind of wonder if maybe that's a conversation we need to have. And then the only other thing I couldn't help but have on my mind was this whole Westport controversy about racism.
Yes.
And, I mean, I've been here for quite some time. I've volunteered in a couple of different organizations, and it's kind of elephant in the room in this province that in certain parts of this province, we do have a problem with racism, just like anywhere else does, where you run into people who will say, and I quote, racism does not exist here.
Yeah.
And people can now point to this and say, yes, it exists everywhere. Let's stop putting our head in the sand and pretending we don't. Just because you don't see it on the evening news every night doesn't mean it's not happening.
And the thing with that Westport, and I want to stress that I'm not saying, and this is the thing that, most of what I've heard about it, aside from what I've read about it, has been open line and back talk. And I mean, they're always saying, no one's saying that the entire town of Westport is racist.
Exactly.
And that it's not indicative of Westport being a racist town or anything. It's just indicative of the fact that this is still in the province. And when it's kids that young, they learned it from somewhere. Yeah. That's all people are saying.
Yeah, and let's face it, to be balanced, I mean, I volunteered with some organizations before, and I mean, even in St. John's, there are some people here who have xenophobic beliefs about immigrants or have discriminatory views towards Asians and call them derogatory names that should never be said, should never be repeated. Yeah. So, I mean, I think part of what's missing with this Westport conversation is that we're missing an opportunity to talk about the fact that racism isn't just a problem in a town of 200 people.
No.
It happens in Toronto. It happens in Vancouver. It happens overseas. It happens in other countries. It happens everywhere. And I just think we're really missing an opportunity to have a much wider conversation.
I agree.
And that's what disappoints me about politics. I often find we miss opportunities to pull together and to see how we're all connected together.
Yeah. Anyway, Jordan, I think we're gonna have to cut it at that.
Yeah, I think that's a good spot
because it's we're at the hour mark exactly.
Oh,
so thank you. I know the time flew, right? So thank you for those that will be listening. It's such a different format now that we're recording, but
it's more like a podcast almost.
But that's kind of what we're aiming for. So anyway, thank you. Listen to the podcast next week. No, I'm joking. It won't be there yet, but cool. Yeah. Bye.